She didn't remember exactly what was in that pecan pie, only that it was dense, cloying, with a sticky layer that clung to the corner of her lips as if it wanted to stay there forever. It was one of those textures that leave a mark more emotionally than taste-wise. That day, her mother's garden was decorated with beige ribbons and overly symmetrical floral arrangements, as cold as the tone with which the hostess greeted her guests. It was September 2019, and Audrey was 29 years old, although in that family they always made her feel inferior, as if she hadn't turned out quite right. She lived alone, in a makeshift studio behind an old auto parts store, where the smell of turpentine coexisted with her dreams plastered on the walls. She sold paintings at fairs when she could, sometimes for less than the frame was worth, but she refused to stop creating. That day, unexpectedly, without seeking it, he stumbled upon the most heartbreaking scene of his life. And the worst part wasn't what he heard. It was discovering it was no longer a surprise. She had always learned to live in the shadow of a brilliant sister, perfect for the family showcase. Elizabeth, the impeccable lawyer, the living pride of a mother who worshipped power more than her own daughters. Audrey, on the other hand, was the one who painted wilted flowers, who cried at documentaries about the ocean, who found poetry in broken things. But that was never enough. Her mother told her with poisoned tenderness that art was beautiful as a hobby, that she had to stop dreaming so much. In that environment where everything had to yield results, her only refuge was Mark. They had been together for 3 years, and even if he wasn't perfect, she felt that he at least didn't want to change her. He brought her ugly flowers, the kind no one buys at the florist, and said they reminded him of her. Unexpected, resilient. Until, hidden in the laundry room behind a half-open door, she heard that phrase, "Audrey is not for you. She's weak. Elizabeth, she does have a future." The voice was her mother's, and Mark's complicit silence. From that moment on, something inside Audrey began to disconnect. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't an explosion. It was more like a slow leak, like when a balloon loses air without anyone noticing. For days, she relived that scene in her head over and over again, questioning whether she had heard correctly, whether perhaps she had misinterpreted. But the signs she had previously ignored now screamed. Mark's absences with vague excuses. The glances exchanged between him and Elizabeth at family dinners. The private laughter when she entered the room. Her sister's perfume permeated his scarf. A night he said he'd forgotten it at a colleague's house. Every detail, which she had previously tried to justify, now struck her like a bitter truth. Audrey didn't scream. She didn't demand explanations. She became an observer of her own tragedy, as if a part of her already knew the ending, had been written for a long time. The wait lasted 3 months. 3 months in which she lived with suspicion like a shadow clinging to her back, breathing down her neck, robbing her of sleep. She didn't check anyone's cell phone, didn't make a scene. She just watched, silently taking note of every gesture, every subtle lie, until one cold December morning, with her heart pounding in her ears, she decided to go to Mark's apartment unannounced. It wasn't an impulse, it was a necessity. When she opened the door, which incredibly wasn't locked, what she found froze her in her tracks. There they were, her sister and her boyfriend, naked between messed-up sheets, laughing about something she never knew. They didn't see her right away. And when they finally did, the silence in the room was as brutal as the betrayal itself. Audrey didn't scream. She didn't break anything. She just took a step back, her heart turned to stone and her hands frozen, as if the air itself had become an enemy. That night, she didn't sleep, nor did she cry. She just sat on the edge of a borrowed mattress in the messy apartment of a friend who took her in without asking any questions. Her body trembled not from the cold, but from rootlessness. There was something deeply disorienting about watching the only certainty you thought you had crumble in a matter of seconds. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the image of her sister with Mark. It was her mother's reaction the next day when Audrey decided to confront her. She called her, her voice cracking but firm, and told her exactly what she had seen. On the other end of the phone, there was a long silence, followed by an impatient sigh. Elizabeth always had more potential. You were always the one daydreaming. As if that sentence alone was enough to justify everything. As if Audrey's pain were an inevitable but minor side effect. And then, without fuss, without a tear, Audrey hung up. She knew in that instant that she was no longer a daughter. She was something loose, discarded. She didn't pack any big bags. There were no dramatic goodbyes. Just a black backpack, her portfolio notebook covered in dried oil stains, and $280 in her account. She booked a bus ticket to Chicago that same week. The city wasn't a special destination, nor did she have a plan. She just knew she needed to be far away, far from the house where everything smelled of judgment, far from the dining room where her mother never looked at her with pride, far from the Sundays of tense silence, from the comparisons disguised as advice. The ride was long and silent. In the bus window, the reflection of her face seemed like that of another woman, thinner, emptier. But deep in her eyes, something still shone, a stubborn spark that refused to go out. This wasn't about starting from scratch. It was about starting with nothing and making that enough. That first night at her friend's house, Audrey couldn't sleep, but she also couldn't cry the way she wanted to. She felt empty, as if her body no longer belonged to her. She stared at the ceiling and felt as if time had become dense, thick, as if the air itself refused to move forward. She remembered every moment with Mark, the little jokes, the songs they shared in the car, the plans to visit Japan, even the way he said her name when he was distracted. Now it all felt false. Not because she doubted it was ever real, but because she realized she had never been enough for him. And more deeply, not for her mother either. What hurt most wasn't being betrayed. It was convincing herself that one day, if she tried hard enough, she would be loved as she deserved. During her first dawn in Chicago, Audrey felt like she'd fallen into the depths of something unknown. The city, covered in a gray blanket of winter, offered her no solace. She walked for hours, more to keep moving than with any clear purpose. She was afraid to stop, to think, to feel again. Once she sat on a bench facing a frozen river and wondered if she'd ever trust anyone again. The answer didn't come. But that silence, instead of shattering it, offered her something else. The idea that maybe she didn't need all the answers to start moving again. Thus, her routine was born. 5 minutes of crying. Then, look for work, show her art, make something, anything, and repeat. A rudimentary system, but effective. Because deep down, Audrey didn't want revenge. She wanted to rebuild, even from the rubble. She arrived in Chicago, one freezing dawn, the wind stinging her cheeks and her knuckles numb from clutching her backpack. The cheap motel where she booked a room had sticky carpet and walls so thin she could hear the guest next door breathing. That first night, she didn't allow herself to break. In her new notebook, she wrote a rule. 5 minutes of crying a day, not one more. She timed it. She'd set her alarm, cry silently, wipe her face, and leave. She'd walk for hours, pass out her portfolio at coffee shops, bookstores, studios, wherever a painting might hang. She ate instant rice with soy sauce, slept in her coat, and avoided mirrors. But even though everything hurt, she didn't feel defeated. She felt a rare kind of hope, the kind that comes when there's nothing left to lose. It was on one of those aimless walks that she saw a sign posted on an office door. Assistant wanted, urgent job, no experience required, just courage. It seemed absurd, even funny. She walked in out of curiosity, and there was Patrick Reynolds, wrinkled shirt, dark circles up to his neck, surrounded by papers as if he'd just survived a shipwreck. He looked at her suspiciously, she with the calm of someone no longer afraid of making a fool of herself. The interview lasted 20 minutes. They didn't discuss degrees. She was honest. "I know nothing about finance, but I know how to bring order to chaos." Patrick laughed. He said that was exactly what he needed. He hired her the next day. Audrey didn't know she had, just opened the door that would change her life forever. The first few days in that office were like entering an emotional minefield. Everything was out of place, papers mixed with food scraps, post-it notes in invented languages, planners with dates crossed out and rewritten. Patrick was a brilliant man, but on the verge of imploding. He talked to himself, forgot meetings, and had a mood swing that would have scared off any other candidate. But Audrey wasn't fazed. She had grown up in a colder, crueler chaos, the emotional one. She used her artistic instinct, that sensitivity so many despised, to understand how Patrick worked without him even noticing. She redesigned the email system, categorized documents by color, turned his scattered ideas into visual maps. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because she was good at it, because for the first time, someone was letting her try. By the third week, Patrick stopped arriving late. By the fifth, he started asking her opinion before making decisions. After 2 months, he was referring to her as my right-hand woman in client meetings. But beyond work, small gestures began to appear that Audrey couldn't quite place. A cup of hot tea on her desk without her asking. A post-it note that said, "You made it easy today," with a drawn face. These weren't advances of love, at least not obviously, but they were kindnesses that came without expectation, without ulterior motives, and that, for someone like Audrey, was a kind of miracle. She, too, began to see him differently. Not as a boss, but as a tired man who still believed in something bigger than himself. One night, after an exhausting day, they stayed in the office until the entire city seemed to shut down. Outside, it was raining heavily, and the buzzing of old lamps was the only thing that filled the silence. Patrick sat on the floor, his back against a poorly assembled shelf, and Audrey was arranging files in boxes that no one had opened in years. Suddenly, he said, almost as if talking to himself, "I'm tired of making money for people who don't believe in anything." The sentence hung in the air, thick, laden with truth. Audrey stopped. She looked at him without responding, but inside she felt a familiar vibration, as if someone had said out loud something she had silently thought 1,000 times. They didn't speak again that night, but something was sealed between them, a kind of silent pact, a promise that still had no form. 2 weeks later, Patrick burst into her desk with a folder of chaotic ideas, drawings, graphs, half-written sentences. He wanted to found something new, a firm that invested in companies with a real purpose, sustainability, social justice, human dignity. "If we don't do it now, we'll regret it for the rest of our lives," he said, his eyes red with exhaustion, but bright with passion. Audrey remained silent, leafing through the papers. Each page seemed incomplete, torn, until she began to organize them. Within hours, the ideas took shape. And when Patrick looked at her in astonishment, he said, "I don't want you to be my employee. I want you to be my partner." Audrey hesitated. She had no money, no last name, no backer, just her job, just her intuition. And for the first time, someone was betting everything on her. Accepting wasn't an impulsive decision. Audrey spent an entire sleepless night staring at the peeling ceiling of the motel where she still lived. She thought of all the times she'd been, told she had no head for business, that she was too emotional, too ethereal, too everything. She thought of her mother, of Elizabeth, of the echo of that brutal phrase, You were always the one who daydreamed. What if she was right? What if this too fell apart? But at dawn, something in her chest cleared. It wasn't courage, it was weariness. Weariness of living in fear, of asking for permission to build. She accepted, not with a grand declaration, but with a new folder, a delivery schedule, and a list of ideas in her small, precise handwriting. That's how Reynolds Capital Partners began. No investors, no luxury, no guarantees. Just two people tired of cynicism, willing to try something different. The first few months were hellish. They took turns sleeping at the office, eating instant noodles and trembling every time the bank account dropped below 3 figures. Audrey wrote proposals with a blanket over her shoulders, and Patrick went out looking for meetings as if he were carrying fire in his pockets. They faced closed doors, ridicule, and awkward silences. But every now and then, something clicked. A small investor, an interested foundation, a family business that believed in them. Audrey designed an evaluation system that wasn't in any manual, a hybrid method between emotional intuition and financial analysis, where each project was also evaluated by its projected worthiness. Patrick called it the Audrey Compass, and although it sounded corny, it became their most powerful tool. Little by little, they stopped surviving. They began to grow. A year later, the firm's name began circulating in circles that had previously been laughed at. A project for veterinary clinics with a social impact, which no one initially wanted to fund, won a national award. Audrey took the stage to accept the award, trembling inside but with a steady voice. She didn't talk about numbers, she spoke of intention, of why it's worth betting on the invisible. From then on, the calls increased. The meetings multiplied. They began receiving proposals from other cities. Patrick, who had previously been the face of the firm, began giving Audrey space, not as a favor, but as someone recognizing a force that could no longer be contained. She ceased to be the assistant who became a partner and became something more difficult to define. A leader who didn't imitate anyone, who didn't raise her voice but made everyone listen, and without planning it, between contracts, shared. Early mornings and knowing silences, Patrick and Audrey began to grow closer in a different way. It wasn't a movie romance. There were no candlelit dinners or declarations on rooftops. It was an intimacy woven with patience, with respect, with glances that said, "I understand," without opening their mouths. Their first kiss came one night when they argued for hours over an investment decision. Audrey, exhausted, leaned on the table and sighed with her eyes closed. Patrick leaned closer and touched her forehead to his as if he wanted to apologize without words. When their lips met, there were no fireworks, just a soft, warm certainty. They were where they were meant to be. The next day, they didn't talk about the kiss. There wasn't a need. All they did was keep working, together, as always. Over the years, Audrey no longer slept in motels. She'd moved into a small but bright loft, with plants that survived thanks to her newly acquired discipline and artwork she no longer sold out. Of necessity, but for pleasure. Patrick lived a few blocks away, and although they never talked about moving in together, they spent more nights in the same place than apart. Their routines intertwined as if they'd been designed to coexist effortlessly. Strong coffee in the morning, silent walks when the day was heavy, and late dinners in the kitchen where they talked about numbers the way others talk about movies. Audrey had become the kind of woman who had once seemed impossible to her, confident, influential, respected. But still, there were nights when she woke with her throat closed, as if something from the past still called to her from some dark corner. That past knocked on the door without warning. One day, during a meeting with analysts, a familiar name appeared on a document. Mark Dorian. He had reappeared on her radar as a mid-level employee at a failing firm that was about to be acquired. Audrey didn't react at the time, but the name resonated with her for hours. Bossy. An impulse, she investigated. Elizabeth, her sister, was listed as a founding partner of a failing firm. Her mother's firm had been acquired by a younger one. It was as if everything that had once crushed her was now crumbling itself. When Patrick suggested they both attend the gala event celebrating the acquisition, Audrey hesitated. He asked her, "Why not close the loop?" And for the first time, she considered that maybe it was time to stop running away. The days leading up to the gala were a mix of vertigo and control. Audrey arranged every detail with surgical precision: the colors of the lights, the type of music, the menu that combined sustainability with elegance, the names on each invitation card. But inside, something creaked. It wasn't fear of facing them. It was fear of what doing so might feel like. She didn't want revenge, nor was she seeking redemption. What she wanted most, although she didn't say it out loud, was to prove to herself that she had gotten out of the labyrinth, that she no longer needed her mother to look at her with pride, or Mark to feel sorry for her, or Elizabeth to respect her. She just wanted to walk through that room as someone whole, as someone free. She chose the dress weeks in advance. It wasn't red or black or gold. It was emerald green, with a classic cut and an open back that revealed the small scar she'd had since she was a child, the mark from a bicycle crash that her mother had always hated in photos. She chose it because it represented something: growth, life, what sprouts even in dry land. When she walked into the restored theater they'd rented for the occasion, all eyes turned toward her. Not because she was shouting, not because she was seeking attention, but because her presence carried weight. She walked with a quiet confidence that made even the haughtiest sit up straight. And then she saw them. Her mother, Elizabeth, and Mark together, but each trapped in their own discomfort. Her mother watched her with a mixture of bewilderment and something Audrey couldn't immediately identify. Was it respect or simply surprise? Elizabeth maintained a rigid posture, her jaw tense, a wine glass swirling in her hand with ill-disguised impatience. Mark, on the other hand, seemed a worn reflection of himself. His suit was too big, his hair thinner, his eyes vague. None of them approached. It was as if they didn't know how to approach someone who no longer fit the narrative they had constructed. Audrey greeted them with a brief, polite gesture devoid of a trace of irony. She didn't need to stage her victory. Her existence there, intact, firm, built with effort and without tricks, was enough to make them uncomfortable. During her speech, Audrey didn't mention names. There were no innuendos. She spoke only of purpose, of resilience, of why some investments are worth more than a financial return. "Investing in human dignity is the safest bet," she said, and Patrick, sitting in the front row, lowered his head slightly, smiling. From the back, his mother stared at her motionless. Elizabeth feigned attention. Mark didn't look up. Audrey wasn't looking for a specific reaction, but when she finished, the audience's standing ovation was a kind of verdict. No one could deny what was before them. She was no longer the fragile dreamer. She was the woman who had turned abandonment into a foundation, exclusion into a platform, wound into muscle. After the event, many people approached her to congratulate her, shake her hand, and ask for advice. Her mother wasn't one of those people. She left early, but before leaving, she stopped a few feet away, looked at her with pursed lips, and said simply, "You look different." There was no hug, no apology, no praise. But Audrey no longer needed it. Sometimes the most restorative thing isn't what the other person says, but what you no longer expect to hear. Elizabeth approached her shortly after, with her usual rehearsed smile and an ambiguous comment. "I didn't know this was your thing." Audrey looked at her without tension, without rancor, and calmly replied, Creating is my thing. I no longer need that to fit in with your things. It wasn't a hurtful statement. It was a naked truth. Elizabeth remained silent, as if for the first time she didn't know how to compete. Mark was the last to approach. His gait was clumsy, his gaze avoiding hers. "I didn't know if I should come, but I wanted to tell you that," he began, but stopped, as if the words had abandoned him at the most important moment. Audrey listened to him in silence. She no longer felt anger or sadness, just a kind of distant compassion, like the kind you feel for someone who once mattered, but no longer has power over you. "Thank you for coming," he said. That was all. She didn't need more. Not because she'd forgiven him, but because in truth, she no longer carried it. She'd let go of that weight a long time ago. And now, seeing him in front of her, all she felt was relief. A deep, warm, final relief. That night at home, Patrick made her a cup of lavender tea, as he always did when she was quiet. He didn't ask how she felt. He didn't demand words from her. They sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring out the window at the Chicago sky, dotted with lights and mist. Audrey took a sip and whispered, "I didn't feel pleasure. I didn't feel anger. Just rest." It was true. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was proving anything. She didn't need anyone to understand how much it had hurt or how much it had cost to get there. The real triumph wasn't being seen by them. It was seeing herself, believing in her worth when no one else did. Sometimes, when she passes a mirror in the middle of the day, Audrey stops. Not to adjust her hair or makeup, but to truly look. She observes her reflection with the quiet curiosity of someone who has returned from a dark place. And in that gaze, she no longer sees the disappointing daughter, nor the betrayed woman. She sees someone whole, not because she has everything, but because she no longer denies herself anything. And when she walks again, she does so with serene certainty. It wasn't success that saved her. It was the courage to stay when everyone else abandoned her, and to start, not from scratch, but from within herself.